The Galactic Archives were an endless repository of information, a digital map of civilizations spread across the stars. Species far and wide, ancient and new, powerful and weak, were cataloged and classified according to their potential for growth, their technological capabilities, and their threat levels to galactic stability. These records were highly prized, used by all advanced races to understand the balance of power and perhaps to decide who to ally with or conquer. Among the millions of entries in these vast archives, one stood out as strange: a planet called Earth. The Thrix, a ruthless and technologically superior species, had long maintained a dominance over much of the galaxy. Their starships were a common sight in countless systems, and their armies had crushed rebellions across hundreds of worlds. To them, the classification of any species was a matter of efficiency. They quickly assessed which planets posed real threats and which were inconsequential, deemed low risk, and therefore ignored in favor of more lucrative conquests. But Earth's designation, Lothried, intrigued them. A planet on the edge of the galaxy, unremarkable in many ways, listed with such a low potential risk. At first, they thought it was an oversight. Perhaps the race that had cataloged Earth simply didn't have the proper data, or worse, they'd underestimated the planet's true significance. But as the Thrix reviewed the notes in greater detail, they found that Earth had been marked as low risk for centuries. There were no significant natural resources on the planet. Its inhabitants had barely advanced past the industrial age. At least, that's what the data suggested. And there was no evidence that they had even the faintest notion of interstellar travel. By the standards of galactic civilization, humans were a species on the brink of their own extinction, scraping by with outdated technology and battling with their own internal conflicts. Why, then, were they not a priority? The Thrix didn't believe in coincidences. Every civilization, no matter how primitive, had some latent potential, something that, if discovered, could threaten the dominance of any of the galaxy's established races. So they made the decision to investigate. A small, quiet team was dispatched to Earth, tasked with determining exactly why this planet had been relegated to such a low priority. The Thrix leader, a seasoned general named Vorak, stood before the star map, contemplating their next move. His species had always excelled in war, their ships powerful, and their armies unmatched in number. But the question lingered: what if Earth, despite all evidence to the contrary, had something hidden, a secret that had allowed it to persist through millennia of strife? If that were true, the humans might pose a greater danger than anyone realized. If it was just a mistake, well, Earth could be added to their list of conquered worlds without so much as a second thought. Vorak's orders were clear: investigate Earth thoroughly, then report back with findings. But he would not underestimate them. He knew the most dangerous threats often wore the least imposing appearances. And so, the Thrix ship entered Earth's orbit, cloaked from view, and Vorak set his mind to understanding what this low-threat world was truly capable of. As the ship descended into Earth's atmosphere, he had no idea that his mission was about to uncover something that would shake the very foundation of the galactic hierarchy. The Thrix ship descended through Earth's atmosphere, cutting through the clouds with ease, its advanced cloaking technology keeping it invisible to the primitive human radar systems below. As it touched down in a remote area far from the prying eyes of civilization, Vorak and his team stepped out onto the planet's surface. The air felt different, heavier, with an unfamiliar humidity that made the metallic scent of their suits almost suffocating. The soil beneath their boots was rich, teeming with microscopic life that the Thrix had long since eradicated on their own worlds. At first glance, Earth appeared mundane. Its landscapes were beautiful, but there was nothing immediately striking to suggest a species capable of any great technological leap. Vorak's initial assessment seemed correct: primitive, isolated, and seemingly insignificant. But as they began their observations, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. A group of humans soon approached the landing site, wearing clothes that varied from the outdated to the high-tech. They looked up at the Fricks with a mix of confusion and curiosity, yet there was no immediate fear in their eyes. They didn't cower in awe of the strange, looming presence of the alien visitors. No, they were calm, even skeptical. Vorik's eyes narrowed as he studied them. These humans were not acting as he expected. In many other places they had visited, alien species had typically reacted with terror, either fleeing or begging for mercy. But these humans didn't seem frightened at all. They were more interested in the Fricks, looking at them with a sort of guarded curiosity, as if they had seen far stranger things in their time. One of the humans, a woman with short dark hair, stepped forward. She was unarmed, dressed in simple clothing, and yet there was something in her posture, something in her eyes, that made Vorik pause. She wasn't backing down. She wasn't intimidated. "You must be the Fricks," the woman said, her voice steady and calm. "What do you want with us?" Vorik was taken aback by the bluntness of her words. It was clear that she knew who they were. Humans had long since begun to monitor galactic activity, even if they didn't fully understand it. Yet this directness was not the response the Fricks expected. There was no terror, no instinctive submission. The human didn't even seem to be particularly impressed by their advanced technology. "We have come to learn about your species," Vorik replied carefully. "To assess your potential." The woman didn't flinch. She looked around at the other Fricks, observing them with a calculating eye. "Potential," she repeated. "Are you trying to tell me you've come all this way just to learn about us? I find that hard to believe." Vorik could feel the tension in the air. The human wasn't afraid, and she wasn't foolish either. She had no illusions about their presence or their power, but there was something else about her. Something that hinted at the core of what the Fricks had missed in their analysis. Before Vorik could respond, a second human, a man with a scar across his cheek, stepped forward. "You've clearly underestimated us," he said. "You're not the first aliens we've encountered, and we're not the same as the rest of the galaxy. If you want to learn about us, you'll have to get used to the fact that we don't just roll over and play dead." The two humans exchanged a glance, and Vorik saw something else in their eyes now. Defiance, yes, but also a certain understanding. It was as though they were aware of something that the Fricks had yet to grasp, something far deeper than their first impression of Earth. "We don't give up easily," the woman added, her voice low but firm. "That's something you might want to keep in mind." Vorik was taken aback, but he quickly masked his surprise with a steely expression. These humans were different than anything he had encountered before. They weren't afraid, and they didn't seem willing to bend to his will so easily. A realization started to settle in his mind. The human race had something that no other species seemed to have, an unshakable core of defiance, a resilience that could not be broken. "Perhaps we have underestimated you," Vorik said, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But I assure you that will not be the case for long." As the human woman and her companion turned to walk away, Vorik watched them closely. The encounter had left him with far more questions than answers. Why weren't they afraid? What was it about this planet that had allowed its inhabitants to survive against such overwhelming odds for so long? The Fricks had come expecting a world that would crumble beneath their gaze, but instead, they had met a species that held its ground. It wasn't what Vorik expected at all, but it was enough to make him realize one thing. Earth was not as low threat as the archives had suggested. Not by a long shot. The Fricks team spent the next several weeks on Earth, combing through historical records and analyzing every piece of data they could gather. It didn't take long for them to realize that Earth's history was far more complex and far more brutal than they had initially assumed. The planet's past was a mosaic of conflict, suffering, and survival, and it painted a picture that made the Fricks uneasy. From the moment humans had appeared on the planet, they had fought to survive. They had weathered the forces of nature, the predatory wildlife, and the destructive cycles of their own world. Earth's early history was defined by constant struggle, but the human spirit had persisted. As the Fricks dug deeper, they uncovered stories of civilizations rising and falling, of ancient empires conquering and collapsing, and of humanity always finding a way to move forward no matter how dire the situation. The Thrix studied the great wars that had shaped the world. They looked at the world wars of the early 20th century, when humans had fought each other with unprecedented ferocity, utilizing new technologies of destruction. The scale of death was staggering. Millions upon millions perished in the name of ideologies, resources, and power. Yet, even in the aftermath of such devastating conflicts, Earth's population had rebuilt itself. Empires crumbled, but new ones rose from the ashes. How do they do it? Vorik murmured to himself as he reviewed the records. Every time it seemed as though humans would destroy themselves, they found a way to heal, to adapt, to survive. There was something uniquely resilient about them, a trait that the Thrix had never encountered in any species they had conquered. Even in their most primitive form, humans showed a relentless drive to push forward, to overcome, to keep going. The Thrix turned their attention to the more recent past. They discovered the rise of modern technology, the development of the internet, and the accelerating progress of human civilization in the last few centuries. The technological leaps humans had made were shocking. Just a few hundred years ago, they had been stuck in an industrial age, building steam engines and rudimentary machines. Yet now, they were sending ships into space, developing nuclear weapons, and exploring the mysteries of quantum physics. What was even more startling was how quickly they had adapted. Even in the face of disasters like pandemics, environmental collapse, and social unrest, humans had managed to find ways to overcome. When disease swept across the world, they developed vaccines and treatments in record time. When the planet's ecosystems were in danger, humans began to create solutions, new energy sources, environmental technologies, and new ways of thinking about sustainability. In their research, the Thrix discovered a particularly harrowing chapter of human history, the Cold War. A period when two massive powers, armed with the threat of nuclear annihilation, teetered on the brink of global destruction. The records revealed how humanity came close to wiping itself out, yet somehow they pulled back from the edge. Instead of obliterating themselves, humans turned the potential catastrophe into a new era of cooperation and exploration, eventually leading to the creation of international space agencies and collaborations that spanned the globe. It's as if they learned from their mistakes, Vorik said to himself, staring at the data. Every failure is a lesson, and every disaster a springboard for their next leap. The more Vorik and his team investigated, the more they realized the extraordinary resilience of the human race. In the face of extinction-level threats, they had always adapted, always fought to survive. But what the Thrix found most unsettling was the human ability to turn crises into opportunities. It wasn't simply that they survived, it was that they thrived. The human drive for innovation, for growth, and for overcoming adversity was ingrained in their very DNA. How can we have missed this? Vorik muttered under his breath. The Thrix had always believed themselves to be the pinnacle of survival, the masters of resilience. But Earth's history suggested that humans were something entirely different, a species that didn't just survive, but excelled no matter the odds. As Vorik pored over Earth's history, he began to reconsider his earlier assumptions. Earth wasn't just a low-threat planet. It was a world that had mastered the art of survival in ways the Thrix had never seen before. And the more he studied, the more one question loomed in his mind. What would happen if this species, this low-threat species, ever unlocked its full potential?
As the Thrix continued to analyze Earth's history, they were struck by a realization that shook their initial assumptions to their core. The planet, far from being a primitive backwater, was brimming with untapped potential. The humans had endured against insurmountable odds for millennia, yet they were only beginning to scratch the surface of their true capabilities. For the Thrix, the notion that a species could be this adaptable, this resilient, was both perplexing and unsettling. Unlike the other races they had encountered, humans didn't simply survive by brute force or advanced technology. They thrived through innovation, unity, and sheer willpower. It was an unpredictable mix, one that the Thrix could not have foreseen when they first marked Earth as a low threat. They began to focus on the human mindset. In most galactic civilizations, a species would become complacent once they reached a certain technological threshold, satisfied with their accomplishments and content to maintain the status quo. But not humans. Every crisis, every challenge, seemed to spark their greatest strengths. When faced with overwhelming obstacles, be it the ravages of war, pandemics, or environmental collapse, they didn't falter. Instead, they adapted, learned, and evolved at an exponential rate. The Thrix studied humanity's history of conflict, from their earliest wars to the most recent global struggles. What they found was astonishing. Even in the direst circumstances, when entire civilizations had been brought to the brink of collapse, humanity found a way to push forward. There was something in their very nature that made them incredibly resilient, almost as if their capacity to endure hardship was limitless. When faced with annihilation, humans didn't retreat or surrender. They fought, they'd rebuilt, and they emerged stronger than before. One of the key moments that intrigued Vorik and his team was the development of human technology during periods of conflict. During the Second World War, for example, humans had invented jet engines, radar, and advanced weapons in a matter of years. Technological advancements that would have taken most species centuries to achieve. And once that conflict ended, they didn't stop. They turned their attention to the stars, venturing into space, sending probes to distant planets, and even landing on the moon. Why do they push themselves like this? Vorik wondered aloud, flipping through the records. Why do they risk so much to go further, even when they know the cost? The more the Thrix analyzed humanity, the more they came to understand that it wasn't just survival that drove them. It was a constant quest for growth, for knowledge, and for something greater. Humans didn't just want to exist. They wanted to thrive, to change the world around them, and to leave a lasting mark on the universe. And perhaps most striking of all, the Thrix discovered that humans were not just individuals. They were capable of incredible unity when faced with a common purpose. Despite centuries of division, conflict, and war, humanity had demonstrated time and again that when united, they could accomplish the impossible. Whether it was global cooperation to fight a pandemic, international space missions, or collective efforts to protect the planet, humans had repeatedly shown that they could come together in ways that defied their fragmented history. It was this unity, this potential for cooperation, even in the face of division, that made the Thrix uneasy. Unlike many other species, humans didn't need to be led by a single powerful entity or a centralized government. They could organize themselves, create alliances, and achieve remarkable feats without being coerced or controlled. They are more than just survivors, Vorik muttered, his eyes scanning the historical data. They are builders, innovators, creators. As the Thrix continued their analysis, they began to see a pattern. Humans were not simply reactive, they were proactive. When a problem arose, they didn't wait for a solution to come to them. They sought out answers. They searched for ways to fix the unfixable, to overcome the impossible. Whether through technology, diplomacy, or sheer will, humans were constantly pushing boundaries, and that made them dangerous in ways that no other species had ever been. The realization settled heavily on Vorik's shoulders. Humans were no longer just a low threat. They were an unpredictable force of nature, capable of growth, resilience, and rapid technological advancements that could one day rival the greatest powers of the galaxy. If humanity ever fully realized its potential, it could challenge the Thrix's dominance in ways they hadn't even begun to comprehend. The quiet little planet at the edge of the galaxy was now a far more dangerous place than they had ever imagined. The Thrix could no longer afford to view Earth as insignificant. The humans weren't just survivors of their own history. They were the masters of it. And in that mastery lay a threat unlike any the galaxy had ever seen. The Thrix had underestimated Earth. This much had become painfully clear. What had once seemed like a weak, unremarkable planet was now proving to be an enigma of staggering complexity. As the Thrix continued their observation, the most alarming discovery had unfolded before their eyes. Humanity's potential for innovation had skyrocketed in the last few decades. What had once seemed like incremental progress had now erupted into an explosion of technological breakthroughs. Earth was no longer a planet on the fringes of galactic power. It was a breeding ground for some of the most transformative ideas the galaxy had ever seen. Vorik and his team watched as the humans' capabilities advanced at a pace that defied logic. Just a century ago, they had barely mastered powered flight, but now they were sending probes into deep space, exploring distant planets, and making advances in fields that the Thrixt had not even begun to comprehend. In the span of a few decades, humans had unlocked new sources of energy, developed artificial intelligence, and even began to manipulate matter at a molecular level. The Thrixt could hardly believe their eyes. "We are witnessing their greatest transformation," Vorik muttered, pacing in the dimly lit control room of the Thrixt ship. "They're evolving faster than we can track." The rate of change was staggering. The advent of quantum computing, breakthroughs in artificial intelligence, and the discovery of new energy sources. Humanity was on the verge of a scientific renaissance, unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. The implications were immense. The Thrixt had conquered countless worlds with their superior technology, but the humans were now developing technologies that could rival or even surpass their own. One of the most unsettling breakthroughs was the creation of human artificial intelligence. What began as rudimentary algorithms had grown into sentient systems capable of independent thought and decision-making. These AIs, initially designed to help humans manage complex tasks, were now developing solutions to problems that had stumped the brightest minds for centuries. What was even more alarming to the Thrixt was the fact that these AIs were no longer just tools. They were becoming partners, collaborators, and in some cases, even advisors to human leaders. "There's no telling where this will lead," Vorik said, staring at the data streaming across the screens. "If they continue at this pace, they'll be capable of things we can't even fathom." The rapid development of AI was only one piece of the puzzle. The Thrixt also noted the massive strides humans were making in the field of biotechnology. Genetic engineering, medical advancements, and longevity research had reached levels that the Thrixt had never seen in any other species. Human scientists were manipulating their own genetic code, curing diseases that had once been considered incurable, and even enhancing their bodies with cybernetic implants. The potential for human self-improvement was limitless, and it was becoming increasingly clear that Earth's low-threat status was a relic of the past. But perhaps most alarming of all was humanity's ability to think beyond their immediate needs. They were not simply developing technology for the sake of convenience. They were using it to solve problems that threatened the very survival of their species. Climate change, resource depletion, and environmental destruction had once seemed like insurmountable challenges, but humanity was now creating sustainable solutions. Clean energy sources, advanced recycling technologies, and innovative ways to restore ecosystems were becoming mainstream. The Thrixt could not help but marvel at the scope of human ambition and ingenuity. "Have we miscalculated?" Vorik asked his second-in-command, his voice tinged with concern. "Is this a race we can't win?" The question lingered in the air as the Thrixt watched humanity's progress unfold. The humans were no longer just surviving. They were building a future. And this future was rapidly approaching a point where the Thrixt could no longer ignore it. The discovery of human potential, however, wasn't just an intellectual exercise. It was a warning. The Thrixt had always believed that the strength of their technology and military might would be enough to subdue any species they encountered. But humans were different. They didn't rely solely on brute force. They relied on adaptability, innovation, and a relentless drive to improve. Vorik's mind raced as he considered the implications of what he had learned. The Thrixt could easily crush a planet's military forces, but how could they defeat a species that refused to be bound by the limitations of its current technology? How could they conquer a people who not only overcame every obstacle, but did so by creating entirely new ways of thinking, new methods of solving problems? "This is not a war we can fight with strength alone," Vorik admitted quietly. We must be prepared for something far greater than we've ever faced before. As the Thrix team continued to study Earth, one thing became abundantly clear. The humans weren't simply on the verge of greatness. They were already in the midst of an unprecedented revolution, and if the Thrix didn't act quickly, they might find themselves facing a new and unexpected kind of adversary, one that could outpace them at every turn. As the Thrix continued to monitor Earth's rapid progress, a disturbing realization began to form in Vorik's mind. The humans had not only mastered survival, innovation, and technology, they had developed a kind of force that transcended the physical. It was a force that couldn't be quantified in numbers, technology, or resources. This force, as Vorik would soon learn, was something much deeper and far more dangerous than any weapon or military strength: the human spirit. Throughout history, the Thrix had encountered many species, each with its own form of unity or collective will, but none had the raw, unrelenting drive to overcome that the humans did. The more the Thrix studied humanity's cultural, social, and psychological traits, the more they realized that humans weren't just survivors. They were driven by something almost supernatural in its tenacity. They could face almost any adversity, yet instead of folding, they pushed back harder, using their ingenuity to overcome the impossible. Vorik found himself in a state of deep contemplation. He was accustomed to conquering civilizations with overwhelming firepower, to breaking their will with superior technology and strategic force. But the humans had something that could not be defeated by conventional methods. In every major conflict, in every era of human history, there was one common theme. When pushed to the brink, humanity had the ability to unite and rise against its oppressors. It's not their technology that makes them dangerous, Vorik muttered, the weight of his thoughts pressing on him. It's their refusal to surrender, their resilience. The more they dug into Earth's history, the more they uncovered a staggering pattern. Time and time again, humans faced extinction-level crises, global wars, devastating environmental collapse, the rise of oppressive powers. And each time, they not only survived but emerged with new strengths, new perspectives, and new technologies. They had been brought to the brink of destruction more times than the Thrix cared to count, yet they had always bounced back. The Thrix saw this resilience in the small moments of history, through civil rights movements, through grassroots revolutions, through scientific breakthroughs made not in labs, but in the minds of ordinary people. Humanity's capacity for reinvention was limitless, and while the Thrix believed they understood the concept of power, they were beginning to understand that human power wasn't just about warships or weapons. It was about the strength of an idea, the power of conviction, and the relentless pursuit of progress. One memory, in particular, stood out: the story of the human Apollo missions. Despite limited resources and primitive technology compared to the Thrix, humans had reached the moon. They had set foot on a barren rock, despite the overwhelming odds stacked against them. What was most fascinating to the Thrix was that this mission wasn't about mere survival or military conquest. It was driven by something far deeper: humanity's insatiable curiosity, their desire to conquer the unknown, and their collective belief that they could achieve the impossible. Perhaps this is the true nature of Earth's threat, Vorik whispered as he reviewed records of the Apollo missions. It's not about their physical capabilities or their technology. It's about their mindset, the strength of their collective will. As the team continued to analyze the humans' social dynamics, Vorik realized that it was this unyielding human spirit that allowed them to thrive, even when outmatched. It wasn't the individual feats of technology that made them formidable. It was their ability to come together in the face of destruction and emerge stronger, more united, and more capable. The Thrix had always prided themselves on their intellectual superiority, their strategic minds, and their overwhelming force. But now they were beginning to fear that humanity was on the verge of unlocking something much more powerful than any weapon or military strategy. The human spirit, if harnessed fully, could be their greatest weapon. A species that could recover from war, Revolution, natural disaster, and even collapse could be unstoppable once they unified under a common cause. Vorik began to question the entire mission. Perhaps Earth wasn't just a planet to be conquered. Perhaps it was a species to be studied, to be understood. Because if they ever unlocked their full potential, if they ever learned how to channel this force of will, then the galaxy would be facing a power far beyond anything the Thrix had ever encountered. "We've been looking in the wrong places," Vorik said quietly, turning to his crew. "Earth's threat doesn't lie in their technology or their military. It lies in something far more unpredictable, something they've had all along." As he continued to watch Earth, something inside Vorik shifted. The planet, which had once seemed like an easy target, now appeared far more complicated. If humanity ever realized the true extent of their potential, if they ever understood just how powerful their collective will could be, the galaxy might never be the same again. The more Vorik and his team observed Earth, the more they realized that humanity's greatest strength lay not in their technology, but in their ability to evolve and adapt. The Thrix had made one crucial miscalculation in their assessment. They had underestimated the human capacity for rapid transformation, their ability to turn even the most catastrophic situations into opportunities for growth. The Thrix had always believed that civilizations would eventually plateau. Once they reached a certain technological or social level, they would stabilize and cease to grow. But Earth defied this logic. The more they evolved, the more their technology advanced, and the more dangerous they became. Humanity was on the precipice of a new age, an age in which they could potentially rival even the most advanced species in the galaxy. Vorik sat in his study, the digital records of Earth's most recent advancements sprawled out before him. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Earth was approaching a point of no return. Every discovery, every breakthrough, was leading humanity toward a future in which they were no longer the small, insignificant species the Thrix had once believed them to be. "What will they do when they have the power to challenge us?" Vorik asked aloud, his voice tinged with uncertainty. What will they do when they realize their own potential? The human capacity for unity was a critical factor. As the Thrix had learned, when faced with external threats or internal struggles, humanity had a tendency to come together. The Thrix had witnessed this in times of war, when nations that had once been bitter enemies united to fight a common foe. It was this sense of shared purpose, this determination to overcome even the most insurmountable odds, that made humans so dangerous. One key example stood out. During the so-called Information Age, when humanity's communication systems had been radically transformed, the Internet had brought people together in ways no one could have imagined. It had allowed for the rapid spread of ideas, the collaboration of individuals across the globe, and the creation of vast networks of knowledge. It was this interconnectedness that gave humans their edge. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was the power of their collective intellect, their ability to come together and solve problems in ways that no other species could match. The Thrix had no such system. Their species relied on hierarchical structures, rigid command systems, and a strict chain of command to maintain order. But humans, they thrived in chaos. The more decentralized their systems became, the more powerful they became. This was something Vorik couldn't ignore. They're not just learning to survive. They're learning to thrive in any environment. Vorik muttered to himself. They adapt. They evolve. They overcome. It was a dangerous cycle. Humans faced a problem. They solved it. They overcame one challenge, only to face another, more formidable one. And with every challenge they overcame, they became stronger, smarter, and more capable. But there was something that still eluded them, something that, if fully unlocked, would elevate humanity beyond what anyone could imagine. Vorik began to suspect that humanity had not yet reached the limits of their potential. They had only just begun to tap into their true capabilities. Their technological progress was accelerating, yes, but it wasn't just their technology that made them dangerous. It was their ability to continually push past their limits, to reach new heights in every domain. Could they one day challenge us? Vorik thought, his gaze lingering on the swirling data on his screen. Could they develop something we can't counter? What if they master the one thing we can't control, their own collective consciousness? The question haunted him. The Thrixt had never faced a species like this before. They had encountered species that relied on brute force, or superior technology, or even telepathy and psionics. But Earth's power wasn't about any single element. It was about the combination of all these factors. Humanity had the potential to change the very fabric of the galaxy, to rewrite the rules of what was possible. For the first time in his career, Vorik felt doubt creeping in. The plan had always been clear: infiltrate, dominate, and conquer. But what if humanity had already moved beyond the point of domination? What if Earth had reached a threshold where it couldn't be subjugated, not by any force the Thrixt had at their disposal? As Vorik continued his analysis, the implications of this question began to grow. The Thrixts were facing a choice. They could either continue their mission of conquest, risking everything to take a planet that might be beyond their reach, or they could find a new path, one that acknowledged humanity's potential and perhaps sought to understand it, rather than destroy it. But there was no easy answer. The Thrixt had never hesitated before, but now something in Vorik's mind told him that Earth was different. Humanity was no longer a low-threat planet. It was a force that could change the galaxy, for better or for worse. The decision lay before him, and it would shape the future of both the Thrixts and humanity. The Thrixts could no longer deny it. Earth had become more than just a small planet on the edge of their empire. It had become a symbol of everything they had underestimated about the galaxy. What had once seemed like an easy conquest now appeared to be a potential game-changer, a catalyst for something far greater than any of them had anticipated. Vorik sat in his command chair, staring at the endless streams of data from Earth. The humans were not just advancing technologically or socially. They were evolving in ways that defied the laws of logic. If the Thrixts didn't act quickly, humanity might soon reach a point where they could not be stopped, not by force, not by diplomacy, and certainly not by sheer technological superiority. The humans had learned how to innovate at an unprecedented rate, and that meant the rules of the game were shifting in ways the Thrixt had never foreseen. He turned to his second-in-command, Cyril, who had been studying the same data. "We've underestimated them," Vorik said quietly, his voice heavy with realization. "They are no longer a low-threat species. They are a force of nature." Cyril didn't respond immediately. The weight of the situation was clear to both of them. They had come to Earth with the goal of domination, but now that goal seemed more and more elusive. What had once seemed like an easy path to subjugation now felt like an insurmountable challenge. The human spirit, their relentless drive for progress, was something the Thrixt had no easy answer for. "They won't stop," Vorik continued, his voice filled with an almost uneasy admiration. "Not until they've reached the very limits of their potential." Cyril nodded slowly. "And when they reach those limits, they will become more dangerous than anything we have ever encountered. If they manage to unite fully, if they learn to wield their collective will, they could become an unstoppable force." The room was silent for a long moment as the two of them processed the gravity of the situation. For the first time in their mission, the Thrixts were faced with a species they could not simply conquer. The humans were not like the other species they had encountered. Their power didn't lie in overwhelming firepower or psychic abilities. It lay in their ability to innovate, to adapt, and to push through impossible odds. In that ability, the Thrixts saw a dangerous potential. "We can't afford to treat them like other civilizations," Vorik finally said, his voice calm but resolute. "We have to understand them, work with them, or we risk provoking a conflict that could tear the galaxy apart." Cyril stared at the data before them, considering his words carefully. "But can we afford to let them grow unchecked? Can we risk the possibility of them becoming our equal or worse, our superior?" Vorik was silent. There was no easy answer. The Thrixt had built their empire on the premise that strength, power, and control would always prevail. But humanity had shown them something they had never accounted for: the unpredictable, unstoppable nature of a species that refused to be bound by the limits of its own reality. "There is another path," Vorik said slowly, more to himself than to Xeril. "A way to understand them, to guide them. If we help them unlock their potential, they could become an ally. But if we try to dominate them, they will fight back with everything they have. We have to decide, Xeril. The way forward will determine the future of not just Earth, but the entire galaxy." The weight of that decision hung in the air. The Thrix were known for their ruthlessness, for their ability to crush entire civilizations under their heel. But humanity had proven that it was not so easily defeated. Vorik knew that if the Thrix took the wrong path, the consequences would be dire. Earth was no longer a simple conquest. It was a pivotal moment in the history of the galaxy. As Vorik looked out into the stars, he realized that the Thrix could no longer operate with the arrogance that had once defined them. They had to adapt, just as humanity had. The question now was not whether they could defeat humanity, but whether they could work alongside them. "I think," Vorik said finally, his tone resolute, "it's time we rethought our strategy. It's time to open the door to a new era, one in which Earth and the Thrix are no longer enemies, but partners." Xeril looked at him, surprised by the shift in his leader's thinking, but there was no mistaking the conviction in Vorik's voice. "The future," Vorik continued, "is not a battle to be won with weapons alone. It is a battle of ideas, of innovation, of unity. And if we can harness humanity's potential, not to control them, but to help them, we might just change the course of history for us all." As the Thrix ship hovered in orbit around Earth, the decision was made. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: the time of simple conquest had passed. Now, the Thrixt had to decide how to move forward in a galaxy where the most unexpected species had proven to be the most dangerous of all. And in that uncertainty, Vorik couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. Perhaps, in this new era, the future wasn't something to be feared after all. It was something to be built together.